That missing door plug from the Alaska Airlines flight has been recovered.
It's still a mystery tonight what caused this brand new plane to crash into the ocean.
Our breaking news: an Ethiopian Airlines flight has crashed shortly after takeoff from Addis Ababa.
But under your leadership, that's what Boeing is, and you're being rewarded for it handsomely. Handsomely. Don't you think there's something wrong with that? Why haven't you resigned?
Senator,
Today, Boeing can feel like a company in constant damage control. Hearings, safety crisis, manufacturing scrutiny, and public distrust. But for much of the 20th century, Boeing represented something very different. A company that helped shape modern aviation itself. Boeing was founded in Seattle in 1916 by a timber businessman named William E. Boeing, who originally launched the company under the name Pacific Aero Products Company. At the time, aviation barely existed. Flying was still experimental, dangerous, and in many ways, unbelievable. Aircraft of this era were fragile machines made of wood, wire, and fabric, and the idea that millions of people would one day cross the globe by air would have seemed almost absurd. But Boeing entered the industry at exactly the right moment, and as aviation evolved, Boeing evolved with it. During World War II, the company became a major supplier of military aircraft for the United States, producing iconic bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-29 Super Fortress. Boeing helped scale up America's wartime manufacturing machine. By the end of the war, Boeing had already established itself as one of the most important aerospace companies in the country. But the company's real rise came in the decades that followed. In the 1950s, commercial aviation entered the jet age. Air travel was no longer just for the wealthy or adventurous. It was becoming faster, safer, and increasingly accessible to ordinary people. As airlines rushed to modernize their fleets, competition inside the aviation industry intensified. Rival manufacturers like Douglas, Lockheed, and Britain's de Havilland were all racing to capitalize on the explosive growth of air travel. De Havilland's Comet had technically entered service first, but a series of catastrophic structural failures badly damaged confidence in the aircraft and reshaped how future jetliners would be engineered. In 1957, Boeing flew the 707 for the first time, and in October 1958, it entered commercial service as the company's first successful commercial jetliner. The aircraft quickly became one of the defining airliners of the jet age. Boeing would ultimately build more than 1,000 707s as airlines around the world rushed to modernize their fleets. Early on, Douglas's DC-8 remained a serious competitor, but over time the 707 gradually pulled ahead and helped push Boeing into the center of the rapidly expanding global aviation industry. International business accelerated, tourism exploded, and global connectivity expanded dramatically. Boeing wasn't just participating in the rise of modern aviation. In many ways, it was leading it. Over the next several decades, the company continued producing increasingly advanced aircraft while expanding deeper into both commercial aerospace and defense. By the second half of the 20th century, Boeing aircraft were carrying passengers across oceans, moving cargo around the globe, and supporting military operations for the United States and its allies. The company's influence had become enormous, but Boeing's defining moment was still ahead. It was now the 1960s, and air travel was still growing rapidly. Airliners were looking for larger aircraft capable of carrying far more passengers over much longer distances. Boeing's response was the 747. This aircraft would become one of the most recognizable airplanes ever built, but at the time, the project looked absurdly risky. Many in the aviation industry expected supersonic aircraft to dominate the future of air travel, while others questioned whether airlines could realistically fill a plane this large. But Boeing pushed forward anyway. The 747 was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was dramatically larger than existing commercial aircraft and required Boeing to rethink nearly every aspect of passenger aviation. The company even built an entirely new factory in Everett, Washington to produce it, which at the time became the largest building in the world by volume. The financial stakes were enormous. Boeing had effectively bet the future of the company on a single aircraft. Boeing had bet heavily on the 747, and failure would have posed serious financial risk to the company. Inside the company, however, there was a belief that this was the future of air travel. This was still an era where Boeing was deeply driven by engineering innovation. The company was willing to take massive long-term risks in pursuit of technological leadership, and in 1969, the 747 made its first flight. This aircraft would go on to transform international travel. Airlines could suddenly transport far more passengers across much larger distances at a lower cost per seat than ever before. Global tourism accelerated even further, and international travel became increasingly accessible to the middle class. The 747 had become a cultural icon and was dubbed the Queen of the Skies. By this point, Boeing had become far more than just a successful manufacturer. It had become one of the great engineering companies in America. But beneath that success, the company was slowly beginning to change. By the 1980s, Boeing stood at the top of the aerospace industry. The company had spent decades building some of the most recognizable and important aircraft in the world, and its reputation for engineering excellence was firmly established. Behind the scenes, however, Boeing was beginning to change. In 1997, Boeing merged with aerospace rival McDonnell Douglas in a deal worth roughly $13 billion. On paper, Boeing was acquiring the company. Many longtime employees and industry observers later argued that culturally, the opposite had happened. McDonnell Douglas's financial-focused culture had taken over Boeing. Others argue that the shift had already begun years earlier as Wall Street increasingly pressured large American corporations to prioritize efficiency, shareholder returns, and financial performance. Boeing had historically been driven by engineers. The company had focused heavily on long-term product development, manufacturing quality, and technical leadership. McDonnell Douglas, on the other hand, had spent years under financial pressure and was increasingly focused on cost controls, shareholder returns, and operational efficiency. Following the merger, many employees and industry observers began noticing a shift in Boeing's priorities. Over time, the company became increasingly focused on financial performance and shareholder value. Boeing eventually moved its headquarters away from Seattle, distancing senior leadership from the factories and engineers that had long defined the company's identity. And while Boeing remained enormously successful, critics would later argue that something important had started to disappear. The company that once bet its future on bold engineering projects was gradually becoming more corporate, more financially driven, and more focused on short-term business pressures. At first, these changes were difficult to see from the outside, but over the next 2 decades, the cracks would slowly begin to emerge. The company was still hugely profitable. Its aircraft still dominated airports around the globe. Boeing continued to look like one of America's great industrial success stories. But inside, pressure was building. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, Boeing faced increasing pressure to reduce costs, improve efficiency, and deliver stronger financial performance. Competition inside the aerospace industry was becoming more intense, particularly after the rise of Airbus. As Boeing pushed to streamline operations, the company began relying more heavily on outsourcing and increasingly complex global supply chains. One of the clearest examples of this was with the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. The aircraft was ambitious, technologically advanced, and highly anticipated. Unlike previous Boeing programs, however, large portions of the aircraft were both designed and manufactured by outside sources. Boeing had hoped that the strategy would reduce costs and speed up production. Instead, it created major delays, coordination problems, and manufacturing complications. The 787 program was nearly 3 years behind schedule and over $12 billion in development cost, 120% over Boeing's original budget. The aircraft did ultimately become commercially successful, but it also exposed growing cracks inside Boeing's production system. And then Airbus made its next move. In 2010, Airbus announced the A320neo, an updated version of its already successful A320, but now equipped with more efficient engines that promise significantly lower fuel consumption. One of the biggest advantages here was how little airlines needed to change in order to introduce the Neo to their fleet. NEO stands for New Engine Option, but the rest of the airframe remained virtually unchanged. This reduced the need for expensive pilot training. The response was immediate. Orders poured in. Suddenly, Boeing found itself under enormous pressure. Airbus had managed to offer airlines major efficiency improvements without designing an entirely new airframe, so Boeing now faced a difficult decision. The company could spend years and billions of dollars developing a completely new aircraft, or they could attempt to modernize the 737 platform that had already been flying in various forms since the 1960s. Boeing chose the second option, and this is where many critics argue Boeing's modern crisis truly began. In 2011, the company officially launched the 737 MAX program. The goal was clear. Boeing needed to respond quickly to Airbus while preserving as much commonality with the earlier 737 models as possible, at least enough that they too could enter airline fleets with minimal pilot training. But there was a problem. The 737 was never designed to accommodate the larger, more fuel-efficient engines Boeing now wanted to use. Unlike newer aircraft, the 737 sat relatively low to the ground, leaving limited clearance beneath the wings. To make the larger engines fit, Boeing engineers were forced to reposition them higher and farther forward on the aircraft wing. Those changes began affecting the plane's handling characteristics in certain situations. So Boeing faced another difficult decision: redesign the plane more extensively, or find another solution. Again, the company chose the second option. Boeing developed a software system known as MCAS, short for Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. The system was designed to automatically push the aircraft's nose downward in certain situations if it detected the plane climbing at too steep an angle. In short, the system was intended to make the 737 MAX perform more like earlier versions of the 737. Boeing wanted airlines to transition to the MAX as smoothly as possible, and they heavily emphasized that pilots already familiar with the older 737 models would require minimal training to fly the new aircraft. They wanted to do what Airbus had done with the A320neo. This created a potentially dangerous situation. While these decisions were being made, internal messages and later investigations revealed growing concerns inside parts of the company, mostly related to development pressure, certification processes, and tight production deadlines. Boeing had also been given increasing authority from the FAA to self-certify portions of the aircraft during the regulatory approval process. This increased authority wasn't unique to Boeing. The system had evolved over decades, built partly on trust, partly on growing technical complexity of modern aircraft, and partly on the FAA's limited manpower. It would later be argued that oversight became too dependent on manufacturers. The 737 MAX first took flight in January 2016 and then entered commercial service the following year. 18 months later, disaster struck. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed into the Java Sea shortly after takeoff, killing all 189 people on board. Only 5 months after that, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed shortly after takeoff as well, killing all 157 people on board. The similarities between these two crashes were impossible to ignore. Investigators would eventually determine that faulty sensor data had repeatedly triggered the MCAS system, forcing the aircraft's nose downward while pilots struggled to regain control. Around the world, regulators immediately began grounding the 737 MAX. Boeing, once viewed as one of the most trusted engineering companies in America, was suddenly facing one of the largest crises in its history. The grounding of the 737 MAX triggered years of investigations, congressional hearings, and intense public scrutiny. Boeing faced allegations that the company had prioritized speed, cost, and shareholder pressure over engineering and safety. Internal messages released during the investigations painted a troubling picture of mounting pressure inside parts of the company. One employee actually described the aircraft as being designed by clowns, who in turn are supervised by monkeys. Boeing eventually redesigned aspects of the MAX, and the aircraft was gradually cleared to return to service beginning in late 2020, but by that point, the company's reputation had already been deeply damaged. And the problems were not over. In January 2024, an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9 suffered a mid-flight door plug blowout shortly after takeoff. A panel covering an unused emergency exit detached from the aircraft, leaving a massive hole in the side of the plane. The incident alarmed passengers and renewed scrutiny of Boeing's safety culture. Remarkably, the aircraft landed safely and nobody was killed, due in large part to the actions of the flight crew. Investigators later revealed that key bolts intended to secure the door plug appeared to have been missing. This triggered another wave of inspections and renewed scrutiny from regulators. And as public pressure intensified, Boeing's leadership also began to change. In 2024, CEO Dave Calhoun announced he would step down as part of a broader leadership shakeup inside the company. But by that point, Boeing's deeper problems no longer appeared tied to any single executive or isolated incident. The door plug failure was only one of several manufacturing and quality control concerns that continued emerging around the company. Public scrutiny intensified even further after multiple Boeing whistleblowers and former employees continued raising concerns about manufacturing standards, production pressure, and quality control inside parts of the company. Boeing increasingly appeared to be a company struggling to regain control of itself. At this point, it would be easy to assume that Boeing was finished, but there's one major problem with this. The modern world still depends heavily on Boeing. Despite years of crisis, the company still continues to hold billions of dollars in aircraft orders. Airlines still need planes. Global air travel continues to thrive, and there are only 2 companies on Earth that are truly capable of producing large commercial airliners at the scale the modern aviation industry requires: Boeing and Airbus. Simply replacing Boeing is not something the global economy can do easily or quickly. On top of this, the company remains deeply connected to American defense, aerospace, and national security infrastructure. Tens of thousands of jobs and massive supply chains still depend on the company. In many ways, Boeing has become too important to fail. But that may also be part of the problem. Boeing's crisis is no longer just about a single aircraft or a single manufacturing failure. It's become a broader question about culture, leadership, and trust. For decades, Boeing was viewed as one of America's great engineering companies. The company built aircraft that reshaped global travel and helped define the modern aviation industry. Engineers once sat at the center of Boeing's identity. The company was willing to take enormous long-term risks in pursuit of technological leadership. But over time, that culture gradually changed. Financial performance, production speed, and shareholder pressure increasingly began shaping decisions once driven primarily by engineering priorities. And while Boeing remains enormously important, the repeated manufacturing problems, delays, and safety crises of recent years have badly damaged public confidence in the company. The real danger for Boeing may not be the collapse, but rather the slow erosion of trust. Companies like Boeing depend on more than factories, patents, or aircraft orders. They depend on confidence. Confidence from regulators, confidence from airlines, confidence from passengers, and confidence from the engineers and workers responsible for building the aircraft themselves. Boeing aircraft will almost certainly continue flying passengers around the world for decades to come. But for many people, the company no longer represents unquestioned engineering confidence in the way it once did. The question now is whether the company can rebuild the kind of culture that made people trust it in the first place. Thanks for sticking around, guys, and if you got anything out of this video, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. We'll see you next time.